The trauma of wrongful convictions is not reserved solely for those imprisoned.
I mean, it's been a struggle. It has.
In 1985, 3-year-old Chad McCrory was asleep in his bed when his 24-year-old mother was murdered just down the hall in their living room. He remembers nothing of that night.
I've got a lot of time and a lot of effort trying to find the truth.
Several months later, he lost another parent when his father, Charles McCrory, was convicted of the murder and sentenced to life in prison. Chad was raised by his grandparents.
They were very adamant that I make my own decision about the case, about things that had happened.
There was never anything that actually tied Mr. McCrory to the crime. There was no eyewitness, there was no confession, there was no forensic evidence, and there was no motive.
What there was a bite mark, or at least something prosecutors claimed was a bite mark. 34 years later, the case came to the attention of Chris Fabricant at the Innocence Project and Mark Loudon Brown at the Southern Center for Human Rights.
So I got the file, read the transcript, and thought there's just no way this conviction should stand.
In 1985, Charles McCrory was a 26-year-old computer programmer in Andalusia, Alabama. He volunteered as an auxiliary policeman and paramedic. He'd recently separated from his wife, Julie, who had been his high school sweetheart.
They started dating. Julie was probably no older than 14, and she was always around, just like one of us. My parents loved Julie just like they did the rest of the family.
Renee McCrory Smith and Laura McCrory Grizit are Charles's younger sisters.
How old were you here?
11.
Both were very close to Julie.
We were best friends. We rode to school together, graduated from high school together, in each other's weddings.
Charles and Julie married in May 1980, and 2 years later, Chad was born. By the time he was 3, the couple had decided to separate.
They were still in a relationship, but they were going through a divorce.
By all accounts, they were on friendly terms.
Charles had got an apartment. She went with him, picked out his furniture. So they had been to the beach on the Monday before she was killed. They had spent the day at the beach together with Chad.
The night of May 30th, 1985. Charles is over at Julie and Chad's house. They watch TV together while he does some laundry.
All right, kiddo. Bedtime. Come here, little one. Shoo, Chatterbongo.
And then he left at some point in the evening.
See you in the morning.
All right, take care.
All right.
And was gone for the rest of the night.
The next morning, Charles rings Julie from work because he'd forgotten his breakfast and hoped she'd drop it off for him. But he doesn't get an answer. Worried, he calls his parents.
Julie?
His father, C.H., goes to the house to check on Julie and Chad.
Julie?
He finds the body of his daughter-in-law. She has been savagely beaten and stabbed multiple times. Chad is safe in his bedroom.
Hey, buddy.
Charles is headed to the house when he hears the emergency call on his radio scanner.
Dispatch, this is McCrory. I'll go check that out.
It's Julie.
Julie!
Julie is lying on her stomach with a bandana around her wrist. and a bloody wound in the back of her head.
And Mr. McCrory allegedly said something like, was it the lick to the back of her head that killed her?
The detectives, naturally suspicious of the soon-to-be ex-husband, find this to be an odd question. They also suspect he has blood on his shoe. It is enough to make him a suspect.
Mr. McCrory, he fully cooperated. He gave them a couple of different interviews.
I got home around 9:30, I think.
They searched his house, his car, his shoes, his clothes, and they didn't find anything connecting him in any way to the murder.
They analyzed scrapings from under Julie's fingernails,
We had our issues,
but the material does not belong to Charles. Neither does the hair found in her hand. And the stain on his shoe isn't blood at all. Still, he remains the only suspect.
What happened was that after he became a suspect, they started to try to develop evidence.
They find a neighbor who says he may have seen Charles's truck in the driveway all night.
So in other words, that he had never left that night was this neighbor's testimony. So we sent an investigator over 40 years later, but the property lines haven't changed, and you could not see that truck in the driveway from the vantage point that that witness had claimed to be able to see that truck.
Then the investigators find their smoking gun.
When they noticed an injury on the body that looked to somebody like a bite mark, and I have looked at it very carefully more than once, and it looks nothing like a bite mark to me. But they got that bite mark evidence and they shipped it off to Dick Souveron.
Dr. Richard Souveron was one of the star dentists who testified in Ted Bundy's trial.
And Dick Souveron decided that it was a bite mark and matched Mr. McCrory to that bite mark.
The Monday of the funeral, we were at the funeral. As soon as it was over, he went in for questioning. And then later that afternoon, I actually heard from a relative that they were going to arrest him.
He is charged with murder. The state offers him a plea deal instead of going to trial.
He was offered like 8 to 10 years and would possibly serve 5 to 6, and he'd be out.
Charles refuses to take the deal that would have required him to plead guilty.
Throughout the trial, it just seemed everything was kind of like a joke. You know, they had fingerprints, and they were like, well, they're Charles's. I'm like, well, of course they're Charles's.
Charles was often in the home, and until recently had lived there. Dr. Souveron was the prosecution's star witness.
You know, he had a lot of clout when he come into, especially into a small town.
They saved him for the end, right? He concluded his testimony saying, it's Mr. McCrory's teeth on her body, and he did it at the time of death.
It's hard not to think, you know, hey, yes, they know what they're talking about. There's no question about it.
Charles McCrory was found guilty for the murder of his wife and sentenced to life in prison.
Biting somebody, it has this, animalistic feel, like that somebody is biting another person. You have to really think about what's going on in the courtroom when an expert is saying, this guy bit her at the time of death, bit her, right? You can't overcome that.
For more than 30 years, his family has stood by him.
Anytime I read an article that has someone that's been trying to deal with bite mark evidence or junk science, I'll write them, asking them if they can help me in any way. I have no idea how many people I've written to.
Laura finally succeeded in finding her brother a legal team. Their first move was to try to get DNA from crime scene evidence.
But that all has somehow disappeared. We've looked for the evidence, we've been told it no longer exists, and we don't know why.
They did have the supposed bite mark assessed by prominent forensic dentists.
We showed them the evidence, and they said it's not a bite mark at all. It's literally just 2 dots.
He said, I can make anyone's teeth match these marks. We're talking about 2 marks.
Then they reached out to the prosecution's key witness, Dr. Richard Souveron.
said, would you take a look at this, knowing what you know now, and just see if you agree, if you stand by your opinions. And he provided us with a sworn affidavit saying that given his decades of experience as a forensic dentist, what he knows now about the limitations of bite mark analysis and comparison, he would no longer testify that way. And that today he could not and he would not testify that this was Mr. McCrory's bite mark.
In 2018, the ABFO made significant restrictions to its standards and guidelines, no longer allowing members to express conclusions unconditionally linking a bite mark to a dentition. But they are still allowed to testify whether or not someone can be excluded, a potentially dangerous exception.
When you exclude somebody, you're using the same level of certainty that you would if you were naming somebody the biter. So if you exclude the wrong person, you still have the same problem.
In the spring of 2021, McCrory's new legal team met up in Andalusia, Alabama. The night before the evidentiary hearing, the prosecutor made a surprising offer.
She said that if he would plead guilty, they would agree to time served, that he could go home.
Charles would have been required to admit guilt and to explain to the court how he committed the murder.
Mr. McCrory turned it down. Could have walked out of prison, but he was not willing to plead guilty to a crime he didn't commit.
We spoke with him right after that had happened, and he was like, you know, I had that chance back 36 years ago. I turned it down. He said, I don't know why they would ask me again.
The following day, the defense presented their case to the court.
In 1985, there was one piece of evidence against Mr. McCrory. It was a bite mark. And they thought at that time that bite marks were good science. And now we know that they're not. And so he should get out.
But overturning any wrongful conviction is an uphill battle.
There are legislative roadblocks, there are political roadblocks, there's fear of litigation. There are so many disincentives to seriously considering whether tragic miscarriage of justice has occurred.
Seeking justice for Julie has also remained important for the McCrory family.
We loved Julie like she was our sister.
It was very devastating, very confusing.
You just want to know what happened. I want to know who did it.
There was other physical evidence that was present at the crime scene that suggested the identity of a different attacker.
There was a construction worker that was known to wear a red bandana right next door to the crime scene that 4 months after this murder was committed, he was convicted of a home invasion rape and served 20 years in prison. That person was never seriously investigated as a suspect in the crime that Mr. McCrory was convicted of.
During his decades in prison, Charles has gotten a PhD in religious studies. He preaches in the prison church and mentors other inmates.
My mother got joy when we would be in line to go in to see him, that other mothers would walk up to her and tell her what good he had done for their son, and that just, you know, really lit her up.
Both of Charles's parents have passed away.
And during our parents' sickness and death, I think that's one of the hardest parts, is that, you know, him not being able to be here for either one of them.
McCrory and his family waited an agonizing 10 months before Covington County, Alabama judge Charles Short issued his decision. In spite of the expert witness recanting his testimony and the emergence of scientific evidence, Judge Short was unconvinced that the outcome of the trial would have been different, and refused to grant Charles McCrory a new hearing.
You know, I was stunned by the decision. I was stunned by the reasoning of the decision.
The ruling said that it didn't matter that Dr. Souveron recanted his testimony, because anyone on the jury could have seen that Mr. McCrory's teeth were a match for the bite mark.
So this decision suggests that rather than using an expert witness, you would ask a lay juror to eyeball some injury and associate it with Mr. McCrory is in my mind, really just a perversion of logic and justice.
I think the bigger problem here is everybody agrees this isn't a bite mark. So even if that were true, even if lay jurors were just as good as experts at matching dentition to a bite mark, this isn't a bite mark. So what are you matching?
The judge also cited the eyewitness who said he saw McCrory's truck in the driveway as justification for his decision.
You know, the prosecution brought him in to testify, and the judge had to cut him off mid-testimony because he didn't make any sense. The judge cut him off and struck his testimony.
The substance of the judge's decision wasn't the only thing that stunned the defense team. Months earlier, District Attorney Walt Merrill and Chief Assistant District Attorney Grace Jeter submitted a 4-page brief arguing against McCrory's request for a new trial. Judge Short's 4-page decision was a near duplicate of the brief submitted by the district attorneys.
We submitted something like a 40-page brief. It doesn't address any of the points we raised. And so it's clear that there was no honest legal analysis going on. And that, I think, is both the process and the substance are, as Chris said, just particularly shocking.
And it's a really good example of just how hard it is to overturn a conviction, and a really good reason why we should stop admitting unvalidated and unreliable evidence in criminal trials, because it's really almost impossible to overturn, even when you have such plain facts as you have in this case.
McCrory's defense team is planning to appeal Judge Short's decision. The process will likely take years.